Hello and welcome to Mississippi Insight. I'm Byron Brown. Thank you for joining us. This week, advocates for teachers criticize a joint legislative committee for leaving out teacher pay raises. We'll hear from them and from key lawmakers. Also, Russ Latino from Empower Mississippi joins us. He'll tell us what priorities his group is keeping an eye on as the legislature prepares for a new session. And federal investigators close the case on Emmett Till's murder in Mississippi. Has justice really been served? We'll take a look this morning on Mississippi Insight. Budget recommendations from a joint legislative panel have raised serious concerns for teacher advocates. While a teacher pay raise was passed in the previous legislative session, it does not appear to be a top priority in the coming year. 12 News' Tal Ta spoke with lawmakers and advocates and filed this report.
Several big-ticket items were on Tuesday's budget recommendation for the upcoming legislative session, but one noticeably left out was funding for a teacher pay raise.
And it is things like this, the legislative budget recommendation, that is so discouraging to teachers that many of them just say, you know, I've done as much as I can do and I'm going to leave.
Our average salary across the whole entire teaching spectrum is about $8,300 less than the regional average. So we've got quite a ways to go.
However, the chairman of the Mississippi Senate Education Committee says he's not concerned because leaders from both chambers have expressed support for teacher pay raises. And in a statement, the lieutenant governor said, providing professional pay for our teachers continues to be a priority for this administration. Senate Education Chairman Dennis DeBar has visited with teachers all over the state and is bringing a plan this legislative session, which reflects their input during these listening sessions.
Tal Ta reporting. Let's bring in now Russ Latino, who joins us by Zoom. He's the president of Power Mississippi, a key advocacy group working to engage citizens in the public policy process. Russ, welcome back to Mississippi Insight.
Glad to be with you, Byron.
First off, any thoughts on the outcry from teachers about their lagging pay? And do you think this is going to be a key issue in the upcoming legislative session?
You know, for the last several years, the governor, the lieutenant governor, the speaker, legislative leadership have made it a priority to try and get teacher pay up. There's a recognition that we're not as competitive as surrounding states when it comes to the Southeastern average. I think there's a recognition that there's a teacher shortage. And I actually think that to some degree the outcry may be premature because my appreciation is that all three of the leaders of the bodies and the governor have it in mind that they're going to address this in a serious way again this year. And that the goal really is to get into a place where we're competitive across the Southeast. And so I would say for folks, obviously pay attention to what's going on, let your voice be heard. But I think that legislative leadership has it well in mind to address this in a serious way.
And why are you so confident that they will address this, and why do you believe it's so important that they do address it?
You know, for one thing, there's a track record now for several years running. There have been increases in pay. So there's been a commitment. You see it in the sort of public statements, really of all three of the sort of the bigs, if you will. The lieutenant governor, and the speaker have talked about this as a priority. We've had conversations with chairmen in both chambers who are looking at it as a priority and trying to figure out the best way to accomplish it. I think there's just generally a recognition that for us to do the best that we can in the classroom, we need qualified teachers. We need teachers who are fully bought in. And then that includes, you know, valuing people when it comes to their compensation. And so I am fairly confident that at the end of the day, Mississippi has been moving in the right direction, will continue to move in the right direction, and ultimately show the support that teachers need to be effective in the classroom.
Lawmakers are in an interesting spot given the rosy revenue picture and the millions in federal funding that have poured into state coffers. What does Empower Mississippi consider the top priorities for that funding?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, you're absolutely right. We're talking about billions of additional dollars that normally the state would not have to spend. Candidly, that presents a range of challenges. I mean, normally you would look at something like that and say, well, that's an embarrassment of riches. It's very important that those resources be spent well because there's a cost associated with it. Obviously, in terms of the national debt, there's a cost associated with the amount of money that's been spent when you look at the inflation picture in the United States. which is as bad as it's been in the last 30 years. And so it's really important that those resources not be squandered, that we don't have death by 1,000 paper cuts, and we apply it to priorities. I think that there's a lot of thoughtfulness being sort of percolating in the legislature right now about how to do that. I would say that there are some big priorities that we would look at and say are incredibly important. There are certainly some infrastructure priorities that I think you'll see some folks coalesce around. I think there are some education priorities. A large chunk of the money that got sent in the American Rescue Plan from the federal government was designated for education, something like $2.6 billion, which is an incredible amount of money. That's generally what Mississippi spends every year on K-12. So we're talking about essentially doubling the resources that are available for a short time period. And then I do think it's worth looking at things like in an era in which the state is so flush with cash, are we in a position where we can return those dollars to the people who earned them in the first place, to working people, and allow them to make use of those dollars in the economy to help create new jobs, to drive new consumerism, and ultimately to create an environment where more people want to move into the state of Mississippi. And so I think there are going to be just a whole host of conversations around how to spend it. Our preference is that it be spent on one-time things, not recurring expenses, because this level of revenue won't stick around forever, and that it be spent on things where there's a big policy sort of outcome or result on the back end, instead of just divvying it up into little pots and not really recognizing the benefit of something like this.
We'll have more with Russ Latino when Mississippi Insight continues. Your group supports efforts to eliminate the state income tax. What sort of research have you been pursuing and evaluating the impact of such a move?
Yeah, so Byron, very early and really last year, before the legislature even took this on, both the speaker and the governor had made it clear that they were interested in the elimination of the income tax. And so, we wanted to approach it in a very thoughtful way. We went out and hired an economist at Rice University, a guy who's done state fiscal impact dynamic modeling across the country. Gave him a couple of scenarios, one scenario in which there wouldn't be any offsets and additional taxes, and one scenario where you would do some offsets to figure out what would the actual impact of this be. It's one thing to have a talking point. It's another thing to kind of understand the larger impact. And he came back and under both scenarios said you'd have increased productivity, you'd see wages go up, you see home values go up because people have more disposable income. And one of the really interesting things that he looked at was in-migration. Now, you know as well as I do that for the last decade, Mississippi has been one of only a few states, really 3 states, that it's been seen as having a loss of population. We've got to create an environment not only where more people are moving into Mississippi and working and contributing to our society and our communities, but candidly, we want to create an environment where more capital moves. And one of the things that he looked at and said is, in states that have reduced their income tax burden, and particularly in the 9 states that don't have income taxes, what they see is an influx of population that doubles the national average, but more than that, an influx of population that brings some wealth and capital to bear for the economies of those states like Texas and Florida that are gangbusters, but also states that skew sort of on the left side of the political spectrum, like Washington, that's seen its economy grow at an exponential pace.
You've noted that Mississippi is in the best fiscal and financial shape in state history, but what happens when years to come when all that federal money is gone?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's certainly a risk, whether you are talking about changing the tax structure or not. Certainly, as an example, after Katrina, Mississippi handled federal funds, I would argue, better than Louisiana did. But what we saw in Louisiana is that their budget expanded massively because of all the federal dollars that came down during Katrina. And then after all that money went away, the budget never pulled back. And so there's a real risk of government kind of growing outside of its natural boundaries whenever you see an influx of resources like this. It's one of the reasons, candidly, that now is probably the best time to think about returning some of those resources directly to the people. I think, if the question is more oriented around how do you fund government if you eliminate the income tax, we can look to the 9 states that don't have an income tax. And what we see is that their tax burden is actually lower as a percentage of their overall economy than Mississippi's. really about half when you look at the average of those states, but that their revenue has grown much faster in all of those states. And that's a byproduct of the population going up in those states. That's a byproduct of economic growth in those states. And so really that's the best of both worlds, that government ends up being very well funded and able to take care of core functions at the same time that citizens have the ability to deploy more dollars in their communities, at local restaurants, at local shops, and then growing the economies.
Let's get back to education front. Your group has been looking at the struggles to find new charter schools in Mississippi. Talk about that and what Empower Mississippi wants to do there.
Yeah, so we believe three things fundamentally on education. One, that the whole purpose of education is to prepare kids for life, and that sometimes we get a little confused about that. We start thinking about the purpose of education as institutions, or the purpose of education as a measurement tool like testing. We want kids that are prepared to contribute to our communities in Mississippi, that are prepared to live meaningful lives. The second thing that we think about is we've got a public education system that the state of Mississippi invests a lot of resources in, that the federal government invests a lot of resources in. It is very important that that system be one where teachers feel like they can contribute. Part of that is that compensation question, but it's much larger than that. We need to let our teachers have the freedom in the classroom. We need to let superintendents have the freedom in their districts to innovate and experiment, and not treat them like they're automatons where we hand down sort of edicts on how they've got to teach in the classroom. And so a big part of what we're sort of focused on is, how do we create more innovation? How do we create an environment where teachers feel like they have the freedom to actually teach and that they can get real meaning out of the job? And then the third thing is, we think families need more options. We've done polling on this. It polls over 80% in the state of Mississippi, where people say, I wish I had more choices when it came to thinking about how to educate the children that are in my family. And so the charter school angle really is an angle about, charter schools are traditional or public schools. They're funded through the public school system. But it really is about creating additional options. Mississippi, unfortunately, has just not approved very many charter schools, which means there are very few options for kids in most communities across the state. I think part of what we're trying to say is that the charter system, the whole point of it is to create sort of a competitive, innovative environment. And the only way to do that is to have more schools approved, and you can have high quality schools approved. And so one of the things that we're looking at is, how do we get to the point that instead of trying to start with kind of a denial mentality, how do we start with a mentality that says we want more options for families, and we're going to work with applicants that want to start charter schools to make sure that they're ready to launch and be successful.
And why has it been difficult to get more charter schools?
I think that would be a great question for the authorizer board. From our vantage point, one of the real risks is that if what you pursue is perfect, then there is no system that is perfect. And I think to some degree, we've made perfect the enemy of good. One of the real features of a charter school is that that charter can be revoked. So unlike a traditional public school that can never be shut down, a charter school, if it's not living up to billing, can be closed. And that's a feature, not a bug, that allows there to be real accountability in the system. I think the danger is that if you approach it as a gatekeeper that says, we're not going to let any schools start if we have even any concern about whether or not they'll be perfect, the end result is that you have very few schools, you serve very few students. One of the things that we see in states that authorize a lot of charter schools is that they don't even get to the point of the deadline for whether or not their charter will be revoked. If they're not performing well, parents vote with their feet. They revoke the charter with their feet by moving their kids to other schools. And so you see hundreds of schools started in a place like Arizona, as an example, where parents report out of this world satisfaction with the options that are available to their kids.
All right, Russ. Well, hey, we often talk about politics and issues, but I can't help but see that Ole Miss sign behind you, that banner. So what's your prediction there on the Sugar Bowl?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I'd be run out of the state if I said we weren't going to win. But I'm excited we're back in the Sugar Bowl. My wife and I have already booked some tickets, and so we'll be down there rooting on the Rebels. It's a good place to be, right? There's a lot of excitement around the program right now.
All right. Good to have you. We got 3 schools going bowling this year, so hopefully we'll go 3-0 this year. All right. Thanks, Russ. Good talking to you, and thanks for your time.
Merry Christmas, Byron.
You too, and we'll be right back. The U.S. Justice Department told relatives of Emmett Till last week that it is ending its latest investigation into his 1955 lynching. The black teen from Chicago was abducted, tortured, and killed in Mississippi after witnesses said he whistled at a white woman. The attack helped galvanize the civil rights movement in America. And there are still calls for justice to be served. 12 News' Anthony Howard has more.
In 1955, Chicago teen Emmett Till was taken from his home, beaten, and killed after allegedly whistling at Carolyn Bryant. The 2 men responsible, Roy Bryant and J.W. Millam, were tried and acquitted by an all-white jury. This sparked civil outrage and fueled the civil rights movement. In the early 2000s, a novice filmmaker presented new evidence causing the FBI to reopen the case.
It's amazing that I was the one who brought the evidence forward to get the case reopened in 2004. And now we're sitting right now talking about a decision that was made. It would be quite helpful, and it would give some closing to this chapter of Emmett Till, or the Emmett Till case, if Carolyn Bryant comes forward and tell us what she knows.
Beauchamp worked closely with Till's mother, Mamie Till Mobley, in her fight for justice in the death of her son.
And it was our way to use filmmaking as an activism tool to make sure that justice prevails in this case.
I hate to say it was not surprising. I reported about a year ago, I was reporting that basically the Justice Department had basically closed this case, and they had.
Jerry Mitchell has spent decades writing investigative stories on cold cases from the Civil Rights era.
I will give the FBI tremendous credit for their investigation of the Emmett Till case. They did a tremendous job of piecing together what information was available.
The question that everyone should be asking is, why hasn't Carolyn Bryant been held accountable for her participation in the kidnapping and murder of Emmett Till, especially when there's overwhelming evidence?
Due to the age of the case, it's beyond the statute of limitations on a federal level, but not the state.
They kind of made a run at that in 2007 and were unsuccessful. So unless the state, changed its mind, decides to pursue those, additional charges, and I think that's probably it. And, unfortunately with this case.
I'm one of these that believes it doesn't matter how old you are. If you're involved in a crime, a serious crime like this especially, then it doesn't matter how old you are, you should be prosecuted.
Devery Anderson is the author of the book Emmett Till, The Murder That Shocked the World and Propelled the Civil Rights Movement.
And even though in the end it did not result in any further prosecution of anybody still living, we learned a lot. Found the trial transcript as a result of that investigation that had been missing for decades. Learned of other people who were involved, found the murder weapon.
The limited series Women of the Movement is inspired by Anderson's book.
Even after the acquittal, which happened in September '55, it took our community over 50 years to come to the place where we would begin to talk about race and racism and what racial reconciliation could look like.
Benjamin Salisbury works for the Emmett Till Interpretive Center in Sumner, Mississippi, where the Till case was tried.
To have this case reopened and then still it being concluded without a person being able to be brought to justice or anything of the sort is, again, it kind of goes back to the fact that that justice has evaded this family and our communities.
Even with the disappointing decision to close the case, the Till proponents acknowledged the victory surrounding the death of Emmett Till.
In recent decades, an act was named after him that was all about the pursuit of these civil rights cold cases that had never been punished.
And this was the catalyst that sparked the American Civil Rights Movement. And he is why we have free liberties in this country. So it really reflects not just on the Justice Department, but it reflects on this whole country in terms of where we're at today when we talk about what justice is.
All the advocates for Emmett Till's justice are hopeful the family receives closure and for Carolyn Bryant Dunham to break her silence after all these years. The decision to continue this case is now in the hands of the county DA's office or the state attorney general.
Anthony, thank you. We'll be right back. Big thanks to Russ Latino and 12 News' Tao Ta and Anthony Howard for their reporting. We'll be back next weekend with more of the political and current affairs coverage that you demand. I'm Byron Brown. From all of us here at 12 News, make it a great weekend.